Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. I'd like to invite you to join me on the next Legal Lines, where my guest is Gene Mills. He is president of the Louisiana Family Forum. Gene's going to talk to us about Christian persecution. It's frankly been going on since the beginning of the faith, and it's going on today. It's happening in the Middle East via ISIS and Iran, and it seems to be happening, at least the seeds sown, to perhaps occur in the United States of America. So join us on the next Legal Lines with Gene Mills, president of Louisiana Family Forum. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to invite you to join me on the next Legal Lines, where we're going to talk about the law and you and why it should matter to you what a law is. You know, in America, in our cities, in our states, in our federal governments, they all pass thousands, hundreds of thousands of laws, regulations every single year, and they either directly or indirectly affect you. That's why you need to know what a law is. It's an exercise of power over people, places, and things. So join us on the next Legal Lines, where knowledge is power. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. Welcome to Legal Lines. I'm very pleased to have on the show Gene Mills. He is the president of Louisiana Family Forum. We're going to talk about a subject that frankly is very disturbing, and that is the persecution of Christians overseas, really all over the world, but sometimes it feels like it's here in the United States of America. Gene, thank you for being on the show.
Good to be with you, Locke.
So kind of give folks a little bit of your background just so they know why they care what you say.
Well, I'm the father of 8 kids, live here in Louisiana, have all my life, feel strongly about the issues that are transpiring at the Capitol, and as an observer of things that take place at the Capitol, I noticed some 20, 25 years ago that there was not a Christian voice to represent faith and family issues, and in conjunction with Tony Perkins, our founder, and a number of other seasoned law professors, you may know Professor Catherine Spate.
Right, saw that.
A number of others. We launched the Louisiana Family Forum to address the concerns that take place at the
And
Capitol.
Tony Perkins was actually a legislative representative 20 years ago, as I recall, or so.
Yeah, Tony was formerly with the city police and wouldn't stand guard over the abortion clinic when he was ordered to as a police officer, and as a result was fired, decided to run for office and change the law that could put him in that position.
And frankly, part of the reason I reached out to you guys is I've seen him interviewed on multiple occasions on all kinds of national TV shows, being a spokesman for this issue, and I figured you guys are a good resource to kind of explain to folks what's going on overseas in the world, and frankly, historically and seemingly, it feels like it's coming our way. So give folks a perspective on kind of the whole concept of Christian. I mean, people go, I don't feel too persecuted. So explain to folks how Christians really have historically always been persecuted.
Yeah, that's true. And I think, Locke, for those of us who live in America, we live like only 2% of people in the world. And unfortunately, that's not a representation of what takes place around the world. But the fact of Christian hostility has existed since Christ.
Right.
In fact, he says in Matthew 9, they hated me before they hated you. And you can anticipate that this faith claim of an exclusivity and a pattern to God that comes only through Jesus Christ, which, by the way, no other claim is made in any other faith tradition. Neither do any other traditions represent a reconciliation and a restoration of fallen man with a righteous God, he being the mediator of the bridge.
He does it all. We do nothing.
And basically, that is offensive to many people. It's offensive to Muslims who have a deep respect for Christ.
He's in the Quran.
He is one of their prophets.
And references some of the disciples as being Muslims.
In fact, when you find the Muslim tradition, they borrow a great deal from Christianity and the early Jewish tradition in order to put together what Muhammad held as a catechism or a belief system that's very different than Christianity. But back to your question of where does the hostility arise? Well, in the Jewish era, the churches then were synagogues. The people then were under the persecution of Rome and other surrounding Middle Eastern tribal people. And when they made these claims of exclusivity, it challenged Caesar, it challenged Augustus, it challenged Nero and the other founders of these particular governmental systems who held that there was no king but Caesar.
Right.
Well, when you brought Christ as a king, all of a sudden you're presenting an offensive to that form of governance. Well, in 70 AD, under Nero's reign, when Rome burned, the dispersion of the Christians took place, and that's really what propagated the gospel around the globe.
And he blamed the Christians for the problems as I recall, the fire that took place that destroyed a lot of Rome, and blamed them and said, let's kill them all.
Christians get a blame for a lot of things, but unfortunately, in many cases, it cost them their lives. In fact, Voice of the Martyrs and a number of other national organizations that track these type of happenings or events put the number of martyrs that are created, martyr for those who
Meaning
are not
they
familiar,
are killed?
because of their faith, exclusively because
We're
of
not
their
talking about
claim
get
to
your arm
Christ.
chopped off or you're stabbed or something. They're killed.
And look, we would be remiss not to notice what Franklin Graham is echoing today, and that is ISIS is doing a genocide against Christians and those of minor religious beliefs,
Including some Muslims.
agreed, throughout the Middle East territories.
Right.
And a genocide of a nature unknown since Hitler is occurring right now under our watch. And the Christian church in America today is absolutely silent.
That's right.
That's the thing that grieves me. In fact, you may recall it was about 3 months ago when the second or third batch of videotape beheadings took place, and they marched out 21 Coptic Christians, knelt them down on the beach and gave them a chance to renounce their faith in Christ. To a man, all of them did not renounce Christ. And when they released the names of the deceased, only 20 names were released. Upon further investigation, we found out the one man in the middle was neither Coptic nor Christian. He was a black man. And he was from a neighboring tribe that happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And when they got to him, he said, I'm of no faith. But these men and their faithfulness and the way they've ministered to me in the midst of this difficult circumstance has so moved me that today their God becomes my God.
Sounds like Christ on the cross with the thief.
And I mean, it had such a powerful resonating effect, especially, I mean, their families celebrated that they were faithful to the end. His promise was you can walk away or you can be faithful to Christ, and we promise you beheading. The thief on the cross did something similar. And that's the powerful, resonating, reconciling component that the Christian gospel offers, is that broken man, an unforgiven man, can walk in forgiveness. And many, far too many today, sadly, are paying the ultimate price for that witness or that testimony.
Gene, I actually was kind of flipping through the web and found this fund called the Nazarene Fund because I was watching the videos and I was being really affected. And that is the whole purpose that as I understand it, the federal government right now will not allow persecuted Christians who need a place for safety, who aren't refugees, that they need a new country to live. They cannot live in their own country, and our own government is refusing to allow them to come.
And I agree that that is a travesty. There are hardship cases that go through the process that sometimes are considered. I understand Catholic Services in Baton Rouge today are receiving some of those Syrian refugees right now and are ministering to their needs. But they're doing so without the blessing of many local, state, and municipal governments. They don't understand that these, in many cases, are not just Muslim benefactors, but in fact, our brothers and sisters in the Lord.
It's an incredible thing that we're watching, but you know, we've talked about historically this has taken place. It really has never stopped. You never, at least I didn't hear you give a number of what the Voices of the Martyrs is indicating, or the numbers that we lose annually.
Historically, that number was held at 100,000. Today, they're moving that number because of the turmoil in the Middle East to somewhere closer to 170,000 a year.
170?
That's one every 2 or 3 minutes.
So we're at a crossroads in history, seemingly.
It certainly is
Certainly a
accelerating.
huge tidal shift. And so the question is, you mentioned that the Christian church and seemingly our government is not doing enough to help the Christians being persecuted overseas. How do we change that?
Well, obviously you have the chance to allow your voice to be heard at the voting booth. That's where your representative form of government can represent ideas like this. Sadly, though, that seems to be something that has become an American tradition. We've set aside religious expression, especially that of a Judeo-Christian faith, and said that that's the majority opinion. Perhaps that's not something we can do anything
All right, well, we'll continue this on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith with Gene Mills, the president of the Louisiana Family Forum. We're talking about persecution of Christians. We'll be right back. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to invite you to join me on the next Legal Lines, where we're going to talk about the law and you and why it should matter to you what a law is. You know, in America, in our cities, in our states, in our federal governments, they all pass thousands, hundreds of thousands of laws regulations every single year, and they either directly or indirectly affect you. That's why you need to know what a law is. It's an exercise of power over people, places, and things. So join us on the next Legal Lines, where knowledge is power. Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. I have the president of the Louisiana Family Forum, Gene Mills. He's on the show, and we're talking about persecution of Christians. Let's dive back in, Gene. So we've talked about historically Christians have been persecuted. At this very moment, Christians are being persecuted. Every 3 minutes, one is being killed, according to the voice of the martyrs. Our country doesn't seem like it's doing much. The church doesn't seem like it's doing much. First of all, how do we get the country motivated?
I think, first of all, we've got to start talking about what's taking place. The fact that Coptics are being beheaded in these Middle Eastern nations is not part of the dialogue of when we talk about this peaceful religion called Islam. And oftentimes it doesn't fall along the lines of either peaceful nor the type of thing that you would consider a religion, but rather a terrorist threat or type of activity. I think we've got to have some serious discussions about how do you segregate and separate those concepts. But there's an Iranian pastor that's in a prison and has been for over 3 years. And through Family Research Council, our national organization, through Family Forum and other state policy think tanks, we've petitioned our government, we've petitioned the president to begin to administer pressure on the nation of Iran.
Good Lord, if he didn't do it when he was negotiating the nuke treaty, I don't know that he's ever going to do it.
By the way, that didn't even come up.
I know, and there was 3 other prisoners, right, in addition to this pastor.
It's imperative when you understand the impact of elections. Ideas have consequences, and those who sit in the highest offices in the land represent the ideas and their consequential impact. And he certainly has. And for the Christian faith and for those abroad, he has proven to be no factor at all in terms of a remedy or relief.
So what do we do about that?
I think you find leadership that will. You begin to initiate within your own faith congregation or faith community a dialogue of what is happening around the world and how can we become more involved. Connecting with organizations like Voice of the Martyrs, Open Doors, Franklin Graham, who's working to bring relief, Life Outreach Today with James Robinson, to know what we can do in terms of bringing physical relief, but also to know what we can do in terms of the bully pulpit that America has in setting the standard around the world for what is acceptable and what would be considered unacceptable.
It's so interesting. It seems like even Europe, and of course there's this huge influx of refugees, purportedly refugees. Some are concerned that it's resulting in some bad players coming in.
I think that's a valid concern.
I agree. But you've got the Prime Minister of England who is openly acknowledging and stating that this is a serious issue, and yet we're not facing that in any way, form, or fashion, seemingly on the federal level. So obviously you're indicating go out and vote in these upcoming elections at the federal level. What do we do about let me point this out. These videos are so traumatizing for most folks. And most folks, you mentioned, we live like kings and queens, even in the greatest poverty here, compared to the rest of the world.
That's true.
People seem desensitized to the things that are happening overseas. How do you change that?
My approach to changing that has been to reach out to the pastors. If you can reach the pulpit, you can communicate to the people. The people have a heart to stand for and to give a voice to those who have none. And our brothers and sisters in these Middle Eastern territories currently don't. For many of us, that may be to work with a local denominational ministry outreach or network affiliate in the Middle East. There are churches that are being birthed. The flip side of this is the persecution has always brought the propagation of the gospel. The old founding fathers held that the blood of both martyrs and patriots alike are what seed the roots of freedom all around the world. And freedom's cry can be heard from these disadvantaged people. I think that that's where we've got to begin to engage. Through your faith community, through your voice at the ballot box, and through your communication with your current elected leaders. I mean, we have a voice. We have those who can not only investigate the findings of what's taking place around the world, but it's very difficult to defend these type of activities.
Gene, are you finding, because you used the word denominations, are you finding that in a way there's like a turf battle? I don't want to join with this group because they don't believe exactly like me, or they don't have the same interpretation of the Bible, or what? Is there a battle of that sort, or are we unified yet as just a body of believers?
That's an
may not
excellent
believe
question.
the exact same thing, but
think
we
it
all
depends on the
recognize the
issue.
evilness of this?
I think the Right to Life Catholics and the pro-life Protestants have reconciled. And because they have a common goal to respect life, the sanctity of all human life, they have joined forces and loaned their voice to the imperatives that they feel are essential. And I think that's a good example of how you can transcend those parochial battles and lend a voice to those who have none. Having to do it abroad is not something that we've been able to put together yet. A dialogue is ensuing about immigration, illegal immigration, and how it transpires on our watch in America, and that would inevitably lead you to the question of how it's transpiring around the world. I think inside of that there's a minor component that we got to address, some of the more radicalized elements of Islam and some of the relief efforts that America still is the greatest benefactor to the remainder of the world.
No doubt about it.
We give more to,
Absolutely.
We're the first ones to arrive on the scene of a crime or disaster, and America's generosity, capacity to give, and willingness to do unto others as they would like done unto them is unparalleled in history, except
Agreed.
for perhaps our Jewish nation of Israel in the Middle East as a sister organization who equally, not in terms of dollars and cents, but in terms of proportion, shows up with a need as grace and tries to provide the necessary benevolence.
And of course have received it because of the great trauma they've been through. Let's shift gears a little bit, because we've talked about the persecution of Christians overseas and what we feel like can be done at the political level and the faith level. But I got to admit, at times, given being a lawyer and reading the cases that I'm reading and seeing the events take place, clerk of courts being jailed and bakers being sued and cake, it's just seems like it's becoming more difficult, or may become more difficult, for a Christian to practice their faith in America. Do you agree?
I do. I believe there's a hostility that's emerging. I believe what formerly was seen as a natural, normal expression of religious faith that transpires all over America throughout the course of its history is now coming under suspicion and in some cases targeted litigation. And I think the effort is to suppress expression. I certainly have seen it in the public schools where the federal courts have said God's not allowed,
Yep.
prayer's not allowed,
Yep.
the reading of the scriptures not allowed, and there's a certain number of other limited activities.
Can't wear certain shirts, as I recall.
You can't. It may be considered hate speech if you're not careful. I think that religious expression is under assault today. I think the courts are where they're going to arbitrate it. Unfortunately, in this circumstance, it looks like some milder forms of persecution, certainly not the type
Right.
that we've seen overseas. But certainly a less than respect is beginning to emerge in America, and that battlefront is being forged and framed right now.
Well, let's talk about it. It seems like the government primarily is the tool being used by those sectors of our society that want to kind of redefine what's acceptable and what isn't. And you look at the recent decision of the Supreme Court, Obamacare mandating the Catholic Church fund abortion, these decisions of these cake makers or pizza folks being driven out of business or paying fines, the clerk of court being thrown in jail. All of that stuff seems to indicate the government's being involved. So let's continue this on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith with Legal Lines. My guest, Gene Mills with Louisiana Family Forum. We're talking about Christian persecution. We'll be right back. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to invite you to join me on the next Legal Lines, where we're going to talk about you and the law. You know, a law is nothing but an exercise of power over you, people, places, or things. But where does that power come from? Where does the government get that power? And how is that power exercised? And do you play a role at all? That's what you need to know. So join us on the next Legal Lines, where knowledge is power. Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. I have Gene Mills, who is the president of Louisiana Family Forum. We're talking about the persecution of Christians. We've talked about it historically, overseas, and now we're talking about, it seems like maybe a little bit here in the United States of America. Gene, I just went through that litany on the previous segment of steps that our government has taken, which seems to indicate, certainly I would use as evidence in a court of law, to show that our government's becoming hostile to the freedom of religion.
I agree with that with one caveat, and that is it appears to be the courts, particularly the federal courts, where you have unelected, unaccountable federal court judges who serve on a lifetime tenure, except for by the Constitution, good behavior, or impeachment.
Agreed, 100%.
And they're bound by the budget. So Congress has the authority to discipline the courts, and they have. I think where the people are most closely involved, that's the form of government that actually still functions. The Congress can be petitioned by the people, and it will move toward the people. The executive branch is touched by the people, and so it moves toward the people.
Exactly.
The courts have believed that they're exempt from that.
Well, frankly, they are.
Until and unless we have a remedy in the Senate where we bring them back up for hearings for reassignment or reappointment.
Well, and I know that I believe it's U.S. Senator Ted Cruz, currently running for president, has actually proposed that there be, I think every 10 years they have to kind of be voted on again, so to speak.
You talked about what would be a solution. That's the closest thing.
Because it makes them accountable.
It certainly does. Unless we're going to return it to the Senate to actually decide who's going to serve in the court and give them the authority to choose the court. But the problem has been...
I'll point out one other thing. The court itself is the one that said they have the final word on what the Constitution means. And the Constitution doesn't say that.
No, it doesn't.
And the president, I think, has at times stated he knows that is not the case.
Now, he debated
and I know
with one of the members
legislators
of the court during one of his State of the Union speech. The court member said, "You lie."
Right.
And he did.
And several of the legislators know that is just something the court decided to do. I mean, the Constitution was set up where power was split between three co-equal. Co-equal means they all have the same amount of power. One's not more powerful than the other.
That's exactly
and
right.
that's how we've gotten to a point where 5 lawyers out of 320 million people tell 320 million people what they got to do. It's incredible. So, I mean, I definitely got some thoughts on that, but
I think many share those thoughts and those concerns, and until we return to a balanced form of government where the court is disciplined, and Congress has the authority to do it. There's 505 members of Congress that have the power to say to the court, with the budget, over jurisdiction, Article 3, Section 2, and over in any number of other matters. Now the question is, do they have the backbone and the courage to do it?
Well, and currently they do not.
They don't.
That's clear. So we have to look at what other options do we have, because we know this is likely what's going to happen. As it seemingly the government becomes more and more hostile towards freedom of religion and freedom of speech, and it collides currently with this new constitutional right that doesn't read anywhere in the Constitution that you have sexual preference, constitutional right to sexual preference. As that collision of those rights occurs, the courts are going to go with, well, freedom of speech and religion is going to be subservient to the freedom of sexual
This new fundamental
selection.
right. This new fundamental right puts a bullseye on every believer in America today. And we've yet to decide where the lines are because that's yet to be litigated. It's likely to start in private and parochial Christian colleges, where they'll be told you have to issue the abortifacient medication and you have to concede on the housing requirements for same-sex couples, non-discrimination policies, that the court, not so much the Congress, have said is the new law of the land. Those are yet to be litigated. That has already begun.
Right.
Outside of that, there's a second tier. It's probably your nonprofits. They're not directly involved under the umbrella of the ministry directly of the church. They're connected to the church. They're faith-based. Many organizations that we're familiar with, many organizations do great work, will likely become the second tier of litigation as they begin to suppress and silence their efforts in the public. With the Christian colleges, it'll be done with the form of student loans. When you can squeeze the money flow, because it's federal student loans, they're approved on the basis of accreditation. Accreditation is what opens the coffers federally for the students to gain tuition access through a federally backed loan.
Right.
When you squeeze that, you've squeezed off the lifeblood of those colleges. Next will be the nonprofit status of the private and parochial nonprofits.
Right.
And
which means that those institutions, whatever monies they receive, will not be tax deductible. And therefore they're going to get less in donations.
Unless they comply and comport with some of these other things. I think another casualty immediately will be judges, justices of the peace who will be told, vacate your seat if you're going to express that.
And this reminds me of the clerk of court in Kansas, I believe, where when she didn't do what the district court judge told her, he threw her in jail.
That's right.
And so we're going to move from this, there are financial consequences to you not doing what we tell you to do,
to criminal and
to criminalizing the behavior. frankly, as it is already in Europe in some places, and which some laws may already exist, the hate crime scenario.
Hate crimes exist in Louisiana?
That's right. And so we're at a tenuous time seemingly in our culture and society, and I think folks need to decide whether or not these rights of freedom of speech and freedom of religion are important to them or not, because if they do not stand up for these rights, they're gonna lose these rights.
I would totally concur. Look, if the enemy is trying to tell you to go quiet, the worst thing you could do is obey him. You ought to go loud and go large. And that's to your faith members throughout your listening audience. This is the time to speak up for those things that you believe in. Somebody paid a dear price, both patriot and martyr, so that you could have those rights.
That's right.
And they're in the flux right now. The question is the decision of the court permanent and irreversible? I don't believe that this court is an infallible court. I believe that that's still yet to be decided. Just like with the pro-life movement, we had the Supreme Court told 50 states, it's like the old rock, paper, scissors. They say, you know, we covered that. Well, that's not necessarily the final word on it.
Right.
That court has been reversed in over 250 instances. And I think it will if the people begin to speak out. And again, it's the democratic process that gives us that authority to do so, unless and until we lose it.
And I want to point out to folks that the issue that we're discussing right now is the decision by the court on same-sex marriage. But it could have been any issue that is causing this collision between rights.
Mm-hmm.
And if folks don't fight for these rights, they're going to lose them. Let's talk about how your organization is kind of addressing this on the national and but particularly in the state level.
Well, Louisiana Family Forum is a think tank that's put together to defend faith, family, and liberty issues. We do it primarily at the state capitol, but also before city councils and school boards. We serve as a lobbying organization representing some 500 churches from throughout Louisiana to provide a voice for traditional families and for faith traditions so that the policy that's being considered will have a clear representation and a clear presentation of the principles that are part of the Orthodox Christian faith. And that's how we attempt to do it.
And so the bottom line is, y'all have studied, I know there's a cultural study that y'all put together, and it is reflecting that the condition of the family in Louisiana is what?
Very bad. It's unhealthy.
And it's reflected in tons of statistics. Gene, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. This is Locke Meredith, Legal Alliance. My guest, Gene Mills with Louisiana Family Forum. Thank you for being with us.